Hello, everybody. My name is Cristian Hernandez-Blick, Head of Public Programming here at Interspecies Internet. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of the trustees in the organization to another Interspecies Conversations lecture. Interspecies Conversations is a monthly online lecture series where leading thinkers share ideas and research that deepens our understanding of animal communication and cognition, often highlighting related insights into the behavior, conservation, and welfare of non-human species. We aim to platform emerging discoveries and host open discussions where the community can join the conversation with questions and feedback. If you enjoy today's event, please consider donating to Interspecies Internet to help support our programming and other projects and activities. You can find a donation link on our website, interspecies.io, as well as in the video descriptions on our YouTube channel. So today we're thrilled to welcome both Jonathan Ledgard and Neil Gershenfeld to discuss the Tehanu project and the first steps towards interspecies economic participation. So Gershenfeld, as some of you may know, is a co-founder and trustee of Interspecies Internet, as well as the director of MIT's Center for Bits and Atoms, where his unique lab breaks down the boundaries between digital and physical worlds. He's the founder of a global network of over 2,500 Fab Labs in 150 countries, chairs the Fab Foundation, and leads the Fab Academy. Gershenfeld has been elected a member of the National Academy of Engineering and a fellow of both the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the American Physical Society. He's been named one of Scientific American's 50 leaders in science and technology, one of 40 modern-day Leonardos by the Museum of Science and Industry, one of Popular Mechanics' 25 makers who are reinventing the American dream, and has been selected as a CNN Time Fortune Principal Voice and recognized by the Prospect Foreign Policy as one of the top 100 public intellectuals. Ledgard is a futurist, critically acclaimed novelist, an award-winning former war correspondent, creator of the interspecies money concept, and CEO of Tehanu, a digital platform enabling other species to pay humans for actions that align with their interests and flourishing. So as a director at the avant-garde EPFL in Switzerland, he pioneered robotics, blockchain, and digital identity projects. Ledgard also invented the cargo drone and drone port concept, bringing the architect Norman Foster in as design lead, and later introducing its use in Africa. He's a leading thinker on risk, advanced technology, and nature, advising up to the head of state level. Today, Jonathan will be presenting on the recent results of Tehanu's pilot project and discussing the Foundation's vision for interspecies equity through digital, AI, and economic representation of non-human species. In a world first, this pilot project used AI, blockchain, and digital identities to assign a family of mountain gorillas digital wallets capable of making payments aligned with their AI-inferred interests. Tehanu envisions this model as a scalable solution for biodiversity preservation, where AI-driven interspecies interactions create economic incentives for protecting wildlife. And in the long term, Tehanu seeks to further non-human species participation in the digital, economic, and AI realms. So with this vision, Jonathan and the team at Tehanu hope to highlight the potential for digital and financial technologies to reshape the way humans interact with non-human life, and the promise they hold for interspecies equity and a new evolutionary future. Jonathan and Neil, thank you for joining us today, and let's turn things over to you two.
Okay, thank you. So Jonathan may be, well, first, I'm here as an outlier. I don't have domain knowledge in interspecies communication. Vint, Surf, and I describe ourselves as plumbers. We just help with the infrastructure. And Jonathan, you can get a sense from that introduction, may be the most improbable person I know. He's done all the things you heard, but maybe the best digest is, at one point I got an email from him, sort of blah, blah, blah. And oh, by the way, I'm traveling up the White Nile, which if you're not familiar, goes through Sudan and Congo. And so just sort of for an outing, he traveled the White Nile through Sudan and Congo. And maybe we can ask him about that trip. I first met Jonathan I think I first met him when we were together on awkward World Economic Forum panels, where we were both sort of there to talk about panels about things we didn't believe in. And underneath that, we've shared an interest in democratizing technology that led to close contacts around drone ports and fab labs. So we've known each other, as we said it, as just before this started, we've been around many blocks together. Jonathan, how did you get from drone ports to money?
It's a great question. I mean, first of all, I should say, Neil, your introduction that you're reinventing the American dream has made my day. Okay, we're relying on you on that one. Uh, yeah, I mean, I think I had these parallel lives, as Cristian mentioned. You know, one half of my life was definitely kind of futurist slash realist. So everything I do, I really wanted to be grounded in the reality. And most of the work that I've been engaged with is really thinking about poorer communities in the tropics, especially here in Africa. I'm speaking to you from Nairobi in Kenya. Um, uh, but on my other side, as a novelist, it's clear that for whatever reason, I'm utterly fascinated in other species and otherness more generally. My first novel was about a herd of giraffes. My second novel was about microbial life uh, in the deep ocean. And it was only when somebody interviewed me, I think, from New Yorker magazine, that I actually reflected that this kind of obsession with other species is very deep in my DNA. But if you remember, Neil, back in the day when I was a director at EPFL in Switzerland, I think one of our first contacts was really just sketching out digital identity questions. And at that time, which was, let's say, uh, 2014, maybe 13, we were asking the question of, is it possible to be very poor in India or in Africa and to have your own digital identity? Even though you at that time did not own a mobile phone, was there some way that you could represent yourself online? And that was kind of the beginning of my journey thinking about digital identity. It, in the end, I would say a lot of that work was kind of naive because it turned out that big tech platforms did control that space, and it was in fact quite hard for for communities to have a digital identity. But it really led me to an epiphany one day that I've been following the whole mobile phone revolution, or cell phone, as you say in the States, um, and how that was moving money into very remote communities. And while I was actually in South Sudan one time, and watching a several hundred-year-old tree being cut down for charcoal, I reflected that if that tree had a mobile phone wallet, if it had a little bit of money in it, maybe it could just point out to the community that it was worth a lot more alive than it was dead. And that started off as an inkling, and then I developed it, and then with the Brookings Institution in Washington, I wrote a big paper, and then we raised some money, and we thought, okay, let's actually try it, And uh, obviously, we're right at the beginning of what I would regard as a multi-generation journey, just the same as interspecies communication is a multi-generation journey. We have to be very humble, but I also think we have to be ambitious as well. So, yeah, that was just some of the background.
Okay, that's a great transition. You sent a video. Do you want to show that now?
Yeah, I thought, I imagine a lot of our audience are working with animals and have the privilege either in captivity or in the wild of spending a lot of time with other species. So I thought it would be good just to show one of the gorillas who has actually sent a mobile money payment. and then we can actually talk about the project. But this gorilla, while you play it, Neil, this gorilla in Kenya, Rwanda is called Gizubizu, which means solution in English. And she was born December 2022, and the Rwandan government gave me the privilege of naming her. And this was one of the very special days in the project for me, because I've had the privilege of spending, a week, a month up in the mountain with these animals. And this day, Gizubizu came to give me a high five. That's her running up, and she just gave me a little high five and then ran off again. And it has been an enormous privilege to spend time with these particular animals, and with primatologists and other experts reflect on what their needs and interests are.
Okay, so the tree is the seed, and we saw the high five. What is agency? How do you figure out what she wants?
Yeah, I think again we really have to imagine we're the Sesame Street level of AI as it will be in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. But
What do you mean by Sesame Street level?
I think that the potential for artificial intelligence to act as a mediator between humans and other species is quite profound. But at this point in our project, what we have shown is, I would say, relatively elemental. So, to be specific, in the interest of time, what we did was we essentially scraped the entire corpus of human knowledge on the mountain gorilla, and we fed that into an LLM, and then we had a separate track with primatologists, veterinarians, rangers, trackers, other people with expertise on the gorillas. And through that whole process, we ended up with several hundred inferred interests that these gorillas might have. And with the primatologists, so to be clear, in this early stage, you're still having human experts in the loop. That's very, very clear. But we narrowed that down to 10 interests, and if anyone in the audience is interested, I'd be delighted to share, the technical details. But essentially, and this I think is exciting for you, Neil, from a kind of bits and atoms ambition perspective of distributed networks and equity and thinking about this. But what is super exciting is, I think over a period of time, the observation of other species and their announcement, if I can say that, of their interests, and then the fulfillment of those interests should lead to a wheel where you're actually improving and refining those interests over time. And I would venture as boldly, and probably my chief science officer will kick me for saying this, but I would venture over a decade into the future, for dozens, maybe hundreds of species, they will be able to articulate their interests to a much greater degree than humans have articulated those interests to date.
So I'm going to come back to that in a moment, but first let's fill in the trajectory. So what is Tahanu? What did you do in Rwanda? What was the first transaction? So come back to the level of Vint and me and plumbing.
Yeah, so Tehanu is an initiative which is meant to build the digital public infrastructure for interspecies money. And we expect that there will be many varieties of interspecies money. So you can think of interspecies money as a generic vacuum cleaner term, and Tehanu is just the first operating vehicle. it was funded primarily by the Ministry of Finance of the government of Rwanda, which shows how progressive and ambitious Rwanda is, both for its wildlife, but also thinking around artificial intelligence and fintech. So we started at the beginning of last year, and we finished the first phase early this year. And what we wanted to do in the project was to show, is it possible to be a non-human and have a secure digital identity which persists over time, even in the wild? So the first pillar was identity. Second, if I have a digital identity and I'm a gorilla, can I hold a digital wallet? That turned out to be actually the easiest bit of the project, because to be clear, to answer an obvious point, it's not the gorilla itself which has the digital identity. It's, let's say, the computational proxy of the gorilla. So it's the digital identity of the gorilla is the representation of the real gorilla. And attaching a digital wallet to that was...
Fill in a little more just on that. So like, who's holding what kind of wallet?
Yeah, what we did originally, do you want me to talk about the identity piece as well, or...
Sure. Yeah, just sort of, if I have a lot of questions about the arc of this, but let's fill in some of the mechanics first. Do you want to show the slide that you had shared?
Yeah. I think this is quite helpful for people just to orientate themselves, because obviously it's a novel concept.
Okay, coming up.
It might help just to sort of talk through the slide. Though I would say that whatever we discuss in this brief hour will raise more questions than it answers, just by the nature of the thing. So we have on the left the gorilla. The gorilla is represented through digital identity. In the case of the mountain gorilla, if any of you get online after this talk or now, you can see that between the nostril and the eyebrow of the gorilla, of a mountain gorilla, is a nose print. It's kind of like a thumbprint, and that turns out to be a unique identifier for each animal. So with a team in Potsdam in Germany, an AI team, very, very brilliant young AI scientists, we were able to build a digital recognition of a simple mobile phone up to, I think, around 96% accuracy. So in other words, if you hike into that rainforest and you took a picture or a video of any of those gorillas, you would know, it would come back which animal it is. And as I say, you would attach a digital wallet to that. What we think in the future is that digital wallet will reside entirely on the blockchain. But in this first pilot, we built an API, let's say a gateway, through a third party to Rwanda's national mobile money network. So the wallet was able, so when a task was asked for based on an interest, a mobile money payment was issued. In this case, in the first stage of the pilot, the payments were going to rangers and trackers, veterinarians, people who are actually working with the gorillas. But what we envisage in the future is that most species are living unprotected in unprotected areas. So this will be less mediated, but the principle is still the same. And you can see on the diagram here the key, apart from obviously the species, the key other actor is the agent. Now, the agent could be a community, the agent can be a scientist, the agent can be a formal conservation worker, like a ranger or tracker. But we again think that as we move forward, for many species, the agent might be just someone in a local community who wants to get a micro payment for providing a micro service. And clearly, and we can dig into this to some degree, this whole chain and process is going to require a lot of transparency and a lot of trust. We believe it's a digital public good. We want it to scale massively, but it has to have ethical oversight and correct science, and obviously be primarily of benefit to the community. And it's an obvious point, and I think many of our audience will understand this intimately, or at least intuitively. We are asking the poorest people on the planet, to preserve the richest biodiversity on the planet. And most of these species are in unprotected areas, as I say, not receiving any value for that. And without veering off too much into my old life as an economist correspondent, we know what the future is in African economies in particular. The population is going to double. We have failed states already. US government has withdrawn financial support. And then we have climate change and so on. So
Jonathan, so let me pick up on your former hat as Economist Africa correspondent. Money is naturally linked to markets. Who pays whom for what?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the honest answer is we don't know. There is an element of Kevin Costner. Do you remember that the Field of Dreams? Build it and they will come. Obviously I speak to a lot of people in quant side in the finance industry. We speak to central banks. I speak to reinsurance companies. What we do know is that the greatest market failure of our civilization is the failure to price non-human life and the services that non-human life provides to the human economy. We estimate that $48 trillion, which is a meaningless sum. It's so large we can't even get a head around it, but it's essentially half of world GDP, is dependent directly on services which are provided by nature.
So that's two slightly diverging routes. So market failures, when all goes well, need market regulators. On the other hand, there's the invisible hand of the market and economies solving better what can't be done. Talk about this ratio between the market solving problems and the need for regulators.
Yeah, I mean, I think the regulatory environment is obviously going to have to be novel as well, because implicit in all the work we've done, and implicit also in the work that you guys are doing at interspecies.io and Earth Species Project and other rights of nature initiatives, is that other species have the right to participate. So there are implications for law, there are implications for ethics, and obviously that does involve the markets as well. But essentially, if I can summarize it very simply, we take the view of nature as infrastructure. To say, if we were to say, for example, Nigeria's population is doubling, it's going to end up at 400 or 500 million people. If Nigeria wants to be rich, it's got to hold on to its insects, its bats, its old growth trees, and some of its small animals. It simply has to, right? There's no way that, because all of those species are providing infrastructure which is required for soil, for water, for natural goods, and for human well-being, even spiritually and in other ways. So if we accept that premise, then we argue that infrastructure should be paid for, and that the market will organize itself around paying for services that protect or enhance the ecological upliftment, if I can say that, in a given ecosystem.
So pick up then, there's Interspecies Internet, which is communication. We're now talking about money. There's a really interesting Venn diagram where they touch. So, economists talk about messaging in the market. It is money communication. Talk about this as a communication channel.
Yeah, I think to me, if we think, if we pose it as a very radical question, simple question, almost a childlike question, which is it only humans, Homo sapiens, us, alone, of all the 8 billion species on the planet, who gets to hold and spend money in order to express their interests or their preference? Or is it possible in some situations, and to be clear, we are talking about only situations where cohabitation is required or whether a species needs triage. So it's not like I don't envisage a scenario where, I might be wrong, but I don't think you need Tahanu in Yellowstone. The National Park Service is doing a really good job. So yes, I do think that it is another form of language. It's another form of saying, "Hey, hi, I'm here. I exist, and I would like to persist a little bit longer in this world."
Okay, so now let me ask two related questions. So a core recurring theme in the Interspecies project is choice and control, is going all the way back to Peter Gabriel with playing music with the bonobos, means of expression. So two related questions are, you described AI inferring. Talk about a roadmap for the bonobo to directly communicate. And when you think about the bonobo communicating, talk about the balance between the bonobo saying, I want a banana, explicitly, and the bonobo implicitly saying, I want a healthy forest to live in. So what does the arc of choice and control look like, and what gets communicated?
It's a great question, Neil, but I'm going to give a very cowardly answer, which is that in this early stage, when we think about the interests, and again, if anyone's interested, I will share a technical summary on the interests that we have for the gorillas. But we are talking about pretty obvious interests for a given species in a given place and time, which are around security, primarily. Making themselves known, which does actually really come back to interspecies.io, because that once you say, hey, I want to make myself known to you consistently over time, I think the bonobo, with maybe the bonobo is not the best example because it's obviously very well studied, but let's say a pangolin. So pangolin would say, hey, I want to make myself known to you, and I'm actually prepared to pay for that. I'm going to pay scientists, I'm going to pay the community for that. And I think over a multi-decade period, that acquisition of data, which the species is actually paying for the acquisition of new knowledge, probably will lead to refinement of those interests. But even then, we have to discern between the practical interests of what we are talking about at Tahanu. So if we say, like, I'm an 11 or 12-year-old male blackback gorilla, that's what we call a male gorilla, just before they go through puberty and become a silverback, what is their interest? Their interest is to knock off the silverback and to grab all the girls, right? Like, that's their primary goal in life, at least at that point in time, that's not the kind of interest that we're talking about here. We're talking about interests to do with freedom of movement, ability to access the food staples that you rely on. I do think one area that we will see very quickly developing is entirely new understanding of veterinary care, because, for example, with the mountain gorillas, the interest suggested that this is a very large mammal which is living at the edge of its evolutionary form. And one of the biggest takeaways I had from just spending this time with the gorillas is, I'm really glad that we invented fire as humans, because the gorilla has to eat 20, 30, 40 kilos of vegetative matter every day, and with more or less a similar physiology to human. And what the AI picked up on, which the human primatologists did not rate so highly, was they really suffer a lot from digestive disorders. So it seems likely to me, but obviously scientists will have to study this more carefully and determine it, but it seems that a gorilla might ask for more micro-veterinary interventions. And say, can I have some dietary supplements? Can I have something which is actually going to reduce the discomfort I feel from having eaten 20 kilos of bamboo? So I don't think it's a very satisfactory answer. I think there are people who are just much more brilliant who can kind of come in on this and actually bring a more rigorous set on that. But I do think we are talking about survival of species primarily. It's just like we're talking about 20 or 30 years getting a bunch of species through this narrow gap that we're in.
So crypto started with a rousing libertarian vision of distributed, decentralized, and we ended up with money laundering and tech bros and large-scale theft. What can go wrong?
Everything can go wrong. Everything can go wrong. But I'm, both very idealistic, but also very cynical, which is to say, if you're not able to deal with the game theoretic risks inherent in a platform as it scales, then you're not going to succeed. But I would say that we could not have had this conversation even 10 years ago, Neil, when we first met, right? Because we have seen underlying technologies develop. So we talk about on the handset side, the human agent, whether it's community or an individual entrepreneur or a ranger, they have access to Chinese smartphones with pretty good cameras and video and so on. And we have now here in Africa and in India, especially, gig economy platforms, including Uber, including Bolt, which everybody said never going to work. It's not going to work. People are going to hack it. People are going to game it. And we studied the Uber model here in Nairobi and found that there are 30 or 40,000 Uber drivers every day, of which I would guess 2,000 or 3,000 of them are trying to break the system every single day. But they don't. They don't, because there is incremental reward. And you build these kind of trust models where a driver is actually saying, I could rip off this client, but if I rip off the client, then I'm actually endangering my trust rating. And so we don't know exactly how Tehanu or similar platforms will evolve in the future, but I think we know enough from the risk side computationally to believe that some of those risks can be mitigated, and you can change the.
So next question, go back to the tree lost to charcoal. Is this for cognitive species, or where else do you think about applying it?
I think we've obviously thought a lot about this in the last year, and we, had a lot of very brilliant people. We have a Nobel Prize economist, Guido Imbens, who's on our advisory board, and we have Kim Stanley Robinson, who some of you will know is a brilliant American sci-fi writer. So from every angle, we've thought about this, and we think, but again, this is speculation, that when the market develops, it will identify two major streams. One stream will be charismatic species, which for humans, we have a relationship to. And these are the same species that we played with as kids, and for better or for worse, this is where, well over half of global conservation funding goes to these species. And obviously, cynically, we picked the gorilla as a pilot for two reasons. One, because there an enormous amount of data and science behind it, so we could actually test against that knowledge base. But two, because it's the Tom Cruise of animal world. So it was able to sell the story to some degree. So I do think there will be a section of the market which will be focused on charismatic species, but the large bulk of money, 80 or 90% of it, I think, will go to species that people don't really think much about or care much about. I would cite bats as a good example of that. Bat species are providing enormous pollination and seed dispersal services. We can say that the carbon sink of the Congo rainforest probably would not exist without various bat species, particularly the straw-colored fruit bat. And those species are not species where there's a great depth of science. The scientists who do work on those species really, really, really struggling to pay even a postdoc or get someone through a PhD or to go to the field. And yet those species, I mean, I would say that the fruit bat I mentioned, probably the services that it's providing every year are in the hundreds of billions of dollars worth of services every year, if you were to quantify it. So I think it's natural that the emergent market will reward species which have the most ecological uplift. And so we'll see money going to old growth trees like fig trees here in Africa, or to bats, or to even insect colonies. I seriously believe that there will be money flowing to ants, to termites.
Let me go to two more questions from me, and then we'll open up. One is, how do you grade yourself? What's your own metric? The species have been doing fine for a long time. How do you judge your helping? How will you judge yourself?
I think, to be honest, scale is the key thing, right? But what we are in such an urgent moment right now, in terms of the human footprint which is coming, and more esoterically, I'm a visiting professor in AI, though of course I'm not a research scientist, but it's possible, we don't know for sure, but it's possible there is a further existential risk. So I think most of everyone who's on the call today understands the existential risk of species extinction and climate change. But there's a further risk, which is we are developing very powerful AI systems which are modeled on profit. They're hyper-capitalistic, and they do not represent non-human life, and particularly the species that I just mentioned, which are the ones providing very, very large ecological services. If you go through the AI systems as we presently have them, the knowledge that these narrow AIs, we don't even need to get into the AGI question, the knowledge that they have is really paltry. So it's possible that in 10, 20 years' time, we'll have very powerful optimization systems on the planet, which do not acknowledge that Earth is made up of an infinite web of complex other species. And if we were to acknowledge that that is a real risk, just say it's a potential existential risk, how would you go about training those systems? What would you do? How would you inform AI that, you know, you have all these ant species and they're doing this and they're doing that? I think the only way to do that is to incentivize the acquisition of knowledge in the wild at an unprecedented level, you know. So, sorry, I can't remember what your original question was, Neil.
That was fine. What at this stage, what do you need?
You know, this is a digital public good, right? So what we need are people who coming from science domain, lawyers, obviously. We haven't even touched on the law. We don't have time to touch on that today, but obviously, once you touch on the question of agency, then it's really important that if a gorilla or another species holds a wallet, that the law recognizes that they have a right to hold the wallet. And we don't necessarily believe that a synthetic crypto hack is good enough for that particular solution. So scientists, lawyers, obviously money is very, very important right now. And then AI, people who are really already beginning to think on the language side, probably you mentioned where does interspecies money and interspecies.io or interspecies communication meet. I think it's when, you know, because I don't think money is an eternal thing. I see it as quite a pragmatic thing for the next few decades. I think it's highly likely that if we get through this period, communities might be looking after other species just because they want to, just because they care about them, just because they see them, you know, and the financial incentives may not be so important. And at that point, then we're really talking about interspecies equity. Say, whatever Earth is at that point, and whatever the natural resources are on Earth, how is it possible for a non-human to say, hey, I want just to survive and to have my little piece of the pie, you know?
I see.
And I do think that language will be a part of that, but probably beyond our lifetime, Neil.
Is interspecies equity going to lead to interspecies equity? Meaning, are you going to go from money to shares and shareholders?
No, I mean equity in a much more.
No, I know, but the words were interestingly suggestive. You could imagine growing the economy. Let's open up for conversation. So you can raise your hand if you want to speak. I can pull questions from the chat. Sana is asking if survival is the most important interest for the gorillas, isn't humans' role mostly to back off? What's the case for creating a platform, thus interfering in their world?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think it's a particularly problematic question for the mountain gorilla because we did a financial valuation on the mountain gorilla, which is, I think, among the most sophisticated financial valuations that's ever been done on a wild animal. And
before you go on, unpack that. Explain how you valued it and what you concluded.
We used all of the standard metrics that you have in conservation science in terms of the utility service that the animal is providing, the existence value in terms of charisma, and in the case of the mountain gorilla, it is on the bucket list of the wealthiest people on the planet. So if you want to see a mountain gorilla, you have to pay a license permit, which is $1,500, and that's massively oversubscribed. And the Rwandan government would like to 10x that. So in other words, if you wanted to see a mountain gorilla in a few years' time, you might be paying $10,000 or $12,000 for the privilege. As a result of that, mountain gorillas are generating about 1.4% of Rwanda's annual GDP. So we're about several hundred animals generating enormous wealth. So there is an inherent tension between the needs of the animal to be free and the needs of a very, very poor country to earn a value which then can be spent on primary schools or primary healthcare and so on. But I think for other species, the question of cohabitation will be a really key one, and I think you will find for many species that they will pay to have humans back off a little bit and say, please don't come in this area, especially when I'm breeding, or please allow me to use this water hole without bringing your cows there, or and so on. You know.
So Ronnie is asking about agency, and a related question to that is, if this is successful, is it invisible to the gorillas, or are the gorillas aware of this system?
Yeah, right now, obviously the gorillas are not aware in any way, and so this, depending on your point of view, could disqualify the whole idea, right? Because what in the end are we talking about if the gorilla is not aware? But there are a lot of very interesting questions which were raised even in this first year of the project. For example, mountain gorillas, they live in this Volcanoes National Park, which abuts some of the poorest communities in Rwanda. So you're literally, and you can look at this online, you're literally walking through potato fields where young women are farming Irish potatoes for $1 a day, $2 a day, for very, very hard labor. And then you hit this wall of rainforest. But the gorillas, as they've become more habituated and as they have become more comfortable with humans, they are venturing out of the park on a very regular basis. And recently they've started to develop a liking for tree tomato, which is a kind of acerbic fruit that is grown commercially in Africa, and they come out of the park to go and find these tree tomato trees. One gorilla one day said, "Oh, this is pretty tasty," and so you have this animal which for several million years has been living one kind of lifestyle, but now is coming out of the park. So it really does raise very interesting ethical questions of if an animal can express its interests, but those interests are not in line with what humans think the animal should be doing. Like, we think that a gorilla should just be hanging out in the rainforest, eating bamboo and doing like classic gorilla things. But the gorilla might say, hey, no, I actually want to wander down to the village and sit in the village square, So that and I think you're going to see a multiplicity of those kind of questions where the other species is kind of pushing back just a little bit and saying, hold on, no, I want something different. So that gets into this question of agency, and obviously that's an infinite question, and I think much of the audience today are much better qualified to think and reflect on that than I am.
Well, unpack that. So the site is Tehanu.io. I think from the chat, there's a lot of interest but concern. How do people give feedback? How do they help? How do people listening have agency?
Well, I think the easiest is Cristian can just share my email, and we can go back and forward.
Okay.
I think there is legitimate reasons for concern, but I would say that everything we've done so far has been with the top scientists and with ethicists and local community and local actors. And I would say that we managed to convert all of the primatologists. You know, they all, and I think apart from that video I showed you of Giza giving me a high five, the best moment so far in the project is one of the primatologists said to me after several months of thinking about the interests of the mountain gorillas, he said, "It's crazy. I've been working with the species for 30 years, and I've never thought about their interests in this framework. And it's
Nice.
completely blown my mind, you know, to actually have this discipline of not thinking about the science of it, but actually just focusing on what are the potential interests."
Okay,
But to
we're
be
almost
honest,
out of time. A few final questions. Holly?
Yeah. Hi, Jonathan. If you read about the AI 2027 scenario that came out like earlier this month, we will reach superintelligence by 2027, right? And so I think a big reason that they say that we will get there is because of AI agents. And so I can imagine an AI agent for each gorilla that goes beyond the digital identity and the wallet. And so then you could collect for each agent, you would collect the individual preferences, maybe through behavioral data or eventually maybe language, even if you're talking dolphins or something that, you know, is actually able, you start to feel to communicate with. And then that would truly represent, hopefully, you know, the gorilla's interests rather than kind of these human projections, right, that we've put on them. So I think that that's a real interesting path forward is the AI agent path.
yeah, I think you're completely right, Holly. Obviously there are still inherent questions in that. It's like, is it obviously with gorillas, we do think that the individual deserves their own agent, right? But for other species, let's say we talk about bats, maybe it's the colony which has an AI agent. But just very quickly to attend to that, it's pretty certain that AI agents will hold and spend money. So in other words, that machine intelligence will have the ability to hold and spend money. The idea that machine intelligence can do that, but biological intelligence cannot, I think is great injustice and a potential failure.
Okay, for time, this will be the last question. And while we do it, Cristian, can you put Jonathan's email in the chat, Treasure?
Yes, Jonathan, thank you for taking my question. Basically, there's a company called Wildlife Protection Solutions, and you can monitor bush cameras remotely to report animals being trapped in snares or other incidents of concern. I was trying to think of a business model here in San Francisco that would allow people to fly drones to locate ghost nets and then bring them back for upcycling. I used to work for Uber as a part of the subscription electric bike model base. And I think you're onto something with regard to being able to assign money to an animal or a culture of animals, being that seems like the common denominator between illegal poaching and illegal fishing is the need to feed people's families. So if there was a way to give them a micro income, especially in protection of eco services or ecosystem services, which, you know, protects wildlands for us to be able to flourish, it makes a lot of sense to be able to ascribe a monetary value to an animal. And I think there's got to be a mechanism to be able to say, hey, this particular species has value, and here's a way you can participate financially on a small scale that will allow you to preserve the animal and at the same time make a living, so you don't have to go on a fishing boat for 2 years at a time to catch squid and anything else you can drag up with a net.
Yeah, no, I think you're completely right, Treasure. And we didn't have time to unpack the whole micropayments, but just as a final point from me, it's obvious that the other species, they hold and they spend money, but they don't necessarily hold money in its entirety. And what they really are going to be doing is as a conduit, as you say, to the poorer communities, and actually enabling them to have a green job in a gig economy fashion, but to have it repeatedly and to have it without this huge infrastructure which we have in the conservation space, where 50-60% of the money is going in kind of overheads for some guy in a Land Cruiser just to turn up once every 2 years. So,
Okay.
yeah.
So in the last minute, there's a lot of challenges, a lot of things you don't know, but thank you for taking this on. In some way, this may be the most central project in the whole Interspecies initiative, which is about giving voice, and you're giving maybe the most potent kind of voice. So noting the challenges and inviting participation vigorously from everyone listening, thank you for taking it on, and 1 minute for closing thoughts.
I just want to give a shout out to interspecies.io. I mean, I think, guys, I watch most of the lectures almost every month. I do think this interspecies space, we can call it, is a very incoherent space. It includes economists, artists, scientists, lawyers, ethicists, and so on. None of us even have the language to properly discuss what is emerging. But what we know is that there is something huge emerging. And we believe that if we are diligent and if we are persistent and if we work according to ethical standards, other species will be able to represent themselves in this planet in a way that will affect our longer term future and make all of us richer and happy.
And on that rousing note, we'll thank Jonathan, and again, Tehanu.io if you want to engage and help shape and feedback. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you. Let's see, we're out of time now. You could post comments in the chat. Thank you, Interspecies.io team, and we'll see you for the next conversation. And Jonathan has to dash off to travel somewhere. Who knows?
Just Paris. Thanks very much.